cold candle smoke, spilled claret, and the loud, easy laughter of men who have never once in their lives been refused. That was the whole flavour of the marriage Frances Meade was handed. For it had been decided at a card table before she had ever heard the man's name. He had thrown a single gold guinea down on the green baize and wagered that he could marry the plainest, poorest woman in London and feel precisely nothing by midsummer. And he won that guinea, and for one whole spring he made her the standing joke of his own dinner table. What the Duke of Alderholt did not know, what it would cost him everything to learn, was that a woman who has watched an honest man beggar himself for a promise can tell you to the farthing what a promise is worth, and had decided, long before she was for sale, that she was not. To understand what he did, you have to understand that he was not, in the ordinary way, a cruel man. Julian Hale, 8th Duke of Alderholt, was 36 kinds of clever and 1 kind of wounded, and the wound did all the talking. A year before Frances, he had loved Lady Cressida Vane the way a proud man loves once, entirely, and without a particle of humour about it, and had believed himself as good as promised to her, and Lady Cressida had weighed him against the Marquess of Farr, who had 11,000 a year more, and had married the 11,000 a year in September with a serene smile and not one word of apology. The Duke of Alderholt did not weep, because dukes do not. He did something worse. He decided that love was a merchant's tale told to make women's arithmetic look like feeling, and he set out to prove it. He proved it at his club, late, 3 parts drunk, with the guinea in his hand. He said to a ring of amused men that any fool could marry for love and be robbed, that the whole business was appetite dressed up in poetry, and that to show them how little the thing signified, he would marry the very plainest, most portionless woman at the next assembly, keep her, feed her, name her his duchess, and feel exactly nothing, and prove that a heart was a purse like any other. Lord Pelham took the bet, a guinea the pair, and the Duke of Alderholt, being a man of his word in the one arena where it flattered him to be, went to the assembly at the Fenwick Rooms to keep it. Frances Meade was standing against the wall by the musicians, where the unpartnered women stood, in a made-over grey gown that had been turned twice and would not be turned again. She was 22, brown-haired, grey-eyed, with a stillness in her that made loud rooms slightly uneasy without their being able to say why. Her father had been a country attorney of scrupulous honesty, who had died repaying, out of his own beggared estate, a debt that was not legally his but had been his in honour. And Frances had grown up on the exact difference between a man's word and a man's bond, and had watched what it cost, and had learned to hold very, very still. Nobody at the Fenwick Rooms could have told you her name. She was precisely what he had come for. He crossed the room to her, magnificent and smiling, and every eye in it followed him, because a duke does not cross a ballroom to a wallflower without the whole ballroom knowing it inside a minute. He asked her to dance. She looked at him, a long, level look, the look of a woman reading a document, and said that she did not think he wanted to dance, and asked what he did want, in a voice with no fear in it at all. It was the first thing about her that he could not have predicted, and he was too far gone in his own cleverness to notice that it was a warning. He married her in 5 weeks. Her people were too poor to refuse a duke and too honest to be glad of him. She went into the marriage with her eyes open, because a portionless woman of 22 who has buried an honest father does not have the luxury of a delicate conscience, and because, she told herself, folding the last of her mother's linen into a trunk, a name and a settled roof were not nothing, whatever they had cost, and she would make of them what she could. She did not love him. She had no illusion that he loved her. That, she thought, at least was clean. She learned about the Guinea on the third night, at his own table, from his own mouth. There were 14 at dinner, all his set, all in on it, and she sat at the foot of the long table in the good silk he had paid for, and watched him hold the whole bright length of it in his hand the way a conductor holds an orchestra. And at the second remove, when the laughter wanted feeding, he took a gold guinea out of his waistcoat pocket and set it spinning on the cloth, and said, to the man on his right, but loudly, for all of them, for her, there she is, Pelham, paid in full. A guinea, gentlemen, that is what a duchess costs, and I'll tell you a secret, I'd not give a guinea more. The table roared. And Frances Mead, Duchess of Alderholt, 3 days married, picked up her glass and drank a little water and did not change color, because she had decided a great many years before that she would not give loud people the thing they came for. And in the small, cold, clear place at the center of her that her father had built, she began, not to plan, she was not a schemer, simply to count. She counted what she was worth to him, which was a guinea. She counted what he was worth to her, which she found, examining it honestly, was rather less, and she put the sum away to look at later, and asked Lord Pelham whether he had come by the North Road, and was so exactly, so unassailably composed that a silence went round the table like a draught, and the Duke of Alderholt looked down its length at his wager and felt, for the first time, a faint, unwelcome sensation he could not name, and chose to call boredom. That was the shape of the spring. He did not beat her, he did not starve her. He did something that in his world was permitted, and is in truth a slower cruelty. He made her a public amusement. The guinea came out at every dinner. He would introduce her to his friends as my bargain, and watch to see if the word landed, and be almost disappointed when she only inclined her head. He seated her, at his own board, in the place a great hostess would take, and then talked across her to Lady Cressida Vane, for Cressida had come back into his orbit that season, all sighing regret, and Jasmine and I was a foolish girl, having discovered that a marquess of 11,000 a year is still only a marquess, and that the duke she threw over was, provokingly, still a duke. He set the two women at the same table on purpose, the wife he had bought and the woman he had wanted, so that everybody could measure the joke, and he never once saw that only one of the two of them had any dignity in the room, and it was not the one wearing jasmine. Frances watched all of it and said little, and missed nothing. She saw that the servants of Alderholt House, who had been braced for a grasping upstart, had within a fortnight begun to bring their troubles to her instead of to the housekeeper, because she listened and did not shout, and remembered which under footman had a mother dying in Deptford, and gave him the afternoon. She saw that the account books, which she had asked quietly to see, and which the steward had handed over with the resignation of a man expecting to be embezzled from, were being bled slow and steady by a wine merchant and a coal factor, who had understood that his grace never read a total, and she stopped it, in an afternoon, with a few civil letters, and saved the estate £400, and told no one, because it was not for him. She saw, above all, Lady Georgiana. Lady Georgiana Hay was the Duke's sister, 19 motherless, thrust out into her first London season like a lamb onto a road, with a brother who loved her carelessly and had no notion how to protect a shy girl from the particular wolves of a ballroom. Frances took one look at Georgiana standing white-faced and wretched at the edge of her first great crush, being cut by a girl she had thought a friend, and did the thing that decided a good deal of what came after. She went and stood beside her, calm as stone, and stayed there, and made the shy girl laugh, and by the small, steady deployment of an unshakable composure turned Georgiana's disastrous first weeks into something the child could survive. She asked nothing for it. But Georgiana, who had no mother and a fool for a brother, learned that season exactly where safety lived in that house, and it was not with the Duke. And into that spring, at an evening party at Lady Harborough's, came Mr. Josiah Kerr. He was a plain, grave, deep-chested man of 60, in a good black coat and no jewellery, and when he was announced, 2 duchesses turned round, because Josiah Kerr was one of the 3 richest men in England and quite the most respected, a shipowner and a founder of hospitals, whose word in the city was better than most men's bonds, and who was received everywhere for the simple reason that his integrity had become, over 40 years, a kind of rank. He had also once, 20 years before, been a client and then a friend of a scrupulous country attorney named Meade, who had saved him a great deal of money and taken none of it, and he had come to Lady Harborough's that night having heard, with a slow, cold anger he was too controlled to show, that his old friend's daughter had been married for a joke. He crossed the room to Frances exactly as her husband had once crossed a ballroom to her, but for the opposite reason, and everyone felt the difference. He bowed to her as though she were the person in the room most worth bowing to. He said he had known her father, that he had never in his life met a straighter man, that he had wondered what had become of Meade's grave little girl, and was glad, and would she do him the honour of presenting him to her husband. And he said it all in a voice pitched to carry not at all, so that it was a courtesy and not a performance, which was itself the sharpest possible rebuke to a house where everything was performance. The Duke of Alderholt watched his purchased wife stand talking quietly with the most respected man in England, watched Kerr laugh, really laugh, at something she had said too low for the room to hear, watched the old man's whole grave face open toward her like a door, and felt the unnameable sensation come back. And this time it was not boredom. It was down under his breastbone, and it had teeth. He told himself it was a front, a nobody monopolizing Kerr. He came across and was witty. Kerr looked at him for a moment with mild, terrible, measuring eyes. The eyes of a man who has spent 40 years reading the difference between a promise and a bond, and was perfectly civil, and turned back to Frances, and the Duke of Alderholt was left holding his wit like a dropped glove, and understood. In a cold flash he refused to keep, that he had just been weighed by the one man in London he could not afford to be found light by, and had come up short, and that his own wife had watched it happen and had not enjoyed it, which was somehow the worst part of all. He went home and could not sleep, and told himself it was the wine. Here is what he had never once done in 3 months of marriage. He had never wondered what she was thinking. She had been a guinea, and a joke, and a still grey presence at the foot of his table, and a man does not wonder what a coin is thinking. But that night, and the next, and the ones after, he found himself doing it against his will, wondering, at his own dinners, behind his own wit, what went on behind those level grey eyes while he spun the guinea, wondering what she had said to make Josiah Kerr laugh, wondering once with a lurch he despised, whether Kerr, a widower it was recalled, these 3 years, had crossed that room for reasons an old man might not admit even to himself. The wondering was the beginning of the end of him, and he did not know it. He thought it was jealousy of Kerr. It was in fact the first sensation of actually seeing his wife, and it had simply arrived, as such things do in a man like that, wearing the mask of wanting to keep her from somebody else. The seeing came all at once, 3 weeks later, and it undid him in a single evening, which is the way it happens to men who have refused to let it happen slowly. He gave a great dinner, the largest of the season, 26 covers, the whole glittering set, Cressida in diamonds at his right hand, the guinea in his pocket, and he meant it to be the joke's masterpiece. But the joke had, without his noticing, been quietly slipping out of his hands for weeks, because a room full of clever people cannot indefinitely be made to laugh at a woman who never once gives them cause, and will, in the end, begin instead to laugh at the man who keeps insisting. Kerr was there. Frances had asked him, as was her right as hostess, and the Duke had not dared cross it. And halfway through the meal, in a lull, Lady Cressida Vane, who had watched her own standing in that house, with her all spring against the unbudgeable stillness of a grey little nobody, and could not bear it, leaned down the table and said, sweetly, that she did so admire dear Frances's gowns, and wherever did she find them, on such an allowance, for she understood the whole marriage had been managed for the price of a, and here she paused, and smiled, and let the table lean in, and said it, for the price of a single guinea. Was it not the drollest thing? And the table did not laugh. It was the smallest thing, and it was an earthquake. There was a beat of silence in which 26 well-bred people declined, all at once and without conferring, to find it funny, in which the joke, held aloft too long, at last turned in the air and came down on the head of the man who had thrown it, and in which the Duke of Alderholt looked down the shining length of his own table and saw, as if a lamp had been lit, 2 things at the same instant that he could never afterward unsee. He saw Lady Cressida Vane, whom he had loved, small and spiteful and jasmine-scented, saying a cruel thing badly and being disliked for it. And he saw his wife. Frances had not coloured. She set down her fork, and she looked at Cressida with those grey eyes that had read so many documents, and she said, mildly without heat, in the voice you would use to correct a small error of fact, a single guinea. Yes, his Grace is quite right to remind us of it, he does, most nights. A pause. It is a great deal of money, when one has none. I hope, Lady Cressida, that you have never had to know exactly what a guinea is worth. It would be a pity to learn it as late as some of us are learning what other things cost. And she picked up her fork. Nobody moved. Old Josiah Kerr, down the table, put his napkin to his mouth to hide what a plain grave man's face does when it is proud of somebody. And the Duke of Alderholt sat at the head of his masterpiece with the guinea a dead weight in his waistcoat, and looked at the woman he had married for a joke, and saw for the first time, entirely, and far too late for it to do him any good, that she was the finest creature in the room, that she had been the finest creature in every room for 3 months while he spun a coin, and that he had taken the one true thing that had ever been handed to him and taught all of London to laugh at it with his own mouth. He had proved his wager. He had married a woman and felt nothing all spring, and now, in the space of one sentence, at the worst possible moment, on the far side of every wall he had built, he felt everything at once, and there was not one thing left he could do with it. He did not sleep at all that night. He stood at the window of his dressing room and took the guinea out and turned it over and over in the dark, and understood the size of what he had done, which is a thing a proud man can sometimes be brought to understand in a single night, though it takes most of them the rest of their lives to do anything about it. He had thought the danger was that he might come to love her and be robbed as Cressida had robbed him. The danger had never been that. The danger had been that he might teach her, thoroughly, patiently, at his own table, night after night, exactly how little he valued her, until she believed him. And she had. That was the part he had got wrong. He had spent 3 months persuading the one person whose good opinion he now discovered he could not live without, that he was not worth having. And he had been extremely convincing. Because it had been true. He came down the next morning early, which he never did, and found her already at the small table in the morning room with the coffee and a stack of the household letters, in the grey gown, doing his accounts. He stood in the door. He said her name, Frances, and it came out wrong, uncertain. A word he had used perhaps 4 times in 3 months, and she looked up at him with a polite, closed, perfectly pleasant face, the face you give a caller, and waited to hear what he wanted, and he discovered that he had no idea how to talk to his own wife, because he had never once tried. He said, clumsily, that the dinner had been, that Cressida had been unpardonable, and that he was, that he wished to say, Frances put down her pen. She said, kindly, that he need not trouble himself, that Lady Cressida had said nothing that was not perfectly true and perfectly public, that he had, after all, established the fact of the guinea himself, at some length, before a great many people, and could hardly complain now that one of them had remembered it. She said it without a scrap of malice. That was the thing that frightened him. There was no anger in her to work with, no wound he could press and be forgiven for pressing. There was only a great, level, finished calm, the calm of a woman who has done her counting and reached her total, and is now merely being civil while she waits for the carriage. He would have given a very great deal, that morning, for her to have thrown the coffee pot at him. She poured him a cup instead, and asked whether he would be dining at home, and went back to saving him £400 he did not deserve. And so began the strangest and most wretched season of the Duke of Alderholt's life, in which a man who had never wanted for anything set out, for the first time, to earn something, and discovered that he had spent all the coin he needed for the purchase before he knew he would want to make it. He tried at first the only ways he knew, which were the ways of a man used to buying. He filled her rooms with flowers, she thanked him gravely, and had them sent to the sick ward of Mr. Kerr's hospital, where they would be of use. He bought her a river of diamonds. She said quite gently that a woman who had cost a guinea would look absurd in them, and that he of all people should feel the force of that, and gave them back. And he stood holding a fortune in cold stones, and understood that she had turned his own joke into a wall he could not climb. He stopped spinning the guinea at dinner. Nobody remarked on it, because by then nobody at his table would have laughed. The joke was thoroughly dead, and its corpse sat between the two of them at every meal. He began slowly and badly to do the harder thing. He learned his own household, the under-footman with the dying mother, the steward's honesty, the exact place in the accounts where she had stanched the bleeding, and found that she had known all of it for months and had simply done what wanted doing without troubling to be thanked. He went himself once on a grey afternoon, in a plain coat and a hired hack, down to a mean street in Deptford to see that the footman's mother had a doctor and a fire, and he sat a half-hour in a room that smelled of tallow and sickness because it seemed to him obscurely that this was the kind of thing a man would do who deserved a woman like his wife, and he told nobody, and it was almost the first unbought thing he had ever done, and it changed nothing at all, because Frances, when the story reached her, as such stories do below stairs, only looked at him a moment with something that was very nearly pity, and said that it was well done, and meant it, and did not soften by so much as a hair's breadth, for she had understood the thing he had not, that a kindness performed in order to be worth somebody is still a kindness with a price on it, and she was done, entirely and forever, with being the reason a man was good. He watched how his sister looked at her. Georgiana, who had a girl's clear, pitiless eye, had stopped speaking to her brother almost entirely, except when politeness compelled it, and reserved for her sister-in-law a fierce, watchful devotion that was, the Duke slowly realized, the plain, visible verdict of the one person in the house who had known him all his life, and had judged, and found him wanting, and gone to stand where the shelter was. His own sister had chosen his wife over him. It was the coldest single fact of the spring, and he had earned it to the letter. Cressida, he ended in one sentence, though he took no pleasure in it. She came to him once, when the season was thinning, and said with the old jasmine and the old certainty that it was not too late, that these arrangements of the Duke's were understood by everybody to be a jest, that a man of his consequence need not be chained to a joke, that she was free, or nearly, and had always, and the Duke of Alderholt looked at her and saw, with the clarity of a man who has recently learned to see, exactly what he had once mistaken for the great love of his life, a handsome, greedy, frightened woman who had taught him, by throwing him over, to become the man who could throw over somebody far better. He said only that she was speaking of his wife, and that she would not do so again in his hearing, and that she should go, and she went, and he found he felt nothing whatever, and was grimly amused to note that the one wager he had actually won, that he could feel nothing for a woman, had come true about entirely the wrong one. But none of it moved Frances, because none of it was the point, and she, being cleverer than he was, and having done her counting long ago, knew exactly what the point was. It was not that he had been unkind and might now be kind. It was that she had discovered what she was worth, and it was not a guinea, and it was not, either, whatever a repentant Duke might now be scrambling to offer her. It was simply herself, entire the thing her father had died to keep unmortgaged. And she had understood that spring, in the small, cold, clear place at her center, that a woman who lets herself be bought back at a higher price has still in the end agreed to be bought. She was not going to agree. Mr. Kerr made it possible for her to say so. He came to her in June, grave and plain and unromantic as ever. He had a sister, a widow, in the clean air of the Yorkshire wolds, a good woman running a good house, and a charity school her late husband had founded, who wanted a gentlewoman of sense and character to share the work and the house and be a companion in a useful life. The position carried a small independent income and a great deal of quiet and no need of anybody's permission but her own. He named it to Frances not as a rescue and not as a suit. He was 3 years a widower and old enough to be her father, and had buried a wife he had loved, and there was nothing in it but exactly what it looked like, which was one honest man discharging a debt to another by making sure the straight man's daughter should never have to be anybody's joke again. He said only that Meade's girl was worth a great deal more than she was being allowed to be, and that there was a door, and that it would stay open, and that she should use it or not as she saw fit, and either way he was her servant. And then he bowed, and went, and left the door open behind him. The Duke found out, because Georgiana, white and furious and 19, told him, flung it at him rather, one evening on the stairs, that Frances was going away, to Yorkshire, to Mrs. Kerr's in a fortnight, for good, and that it was his own doing, and that she, Georgiana, would never forgive him, and went up to her room and shut the door hard enough to shake the house. He found Frances in the morning room, packing the household keys into their box to hand over, her father's small worn book of the law open on the table beside her, where she had been reading it, as she did when she needed her father. He shut the door, and the Duke of Alderholt, who had crossed a ballroom once to win a guinea, did the only wholly honest thing of his life. He did not offer her diamonds or flowers, or the 11,000 a year that Cressida had preferred. He took the guinea out of his waistcoat. He had carried it every day since the wager, first as a trophy and now as something else, and he put it down on the table between them, and he said, in a voice with nothing left in it but the truth, I know exactly what I am worth to you. I have spent the spring establishing it, in front of everyone with my own mouth, and I did it thoroughly, and I cannot unsay it, and I would not insult you by pretending it can be unsaid. I only wanted to tell you, before you go, that you were never the joke. I was. I proved my wager, and I lost everything I had, and did not know I had, and the whole of it, every dinner, every night I spun that coin, was one man too much of a coward to know he had been handed the only good thing in his life. I have no right at all to ask you to stay. I am asking. That is all. I know it is not enough. I know it is a guinea offered for something past all price. But it is everything I have, and it is yours, and it was always yours. From the third night, though it took me until now to be man enough to say so. And Frances Meade looked at him for a long moment with the grey eyes that had done so much counting, and she was not unmoved. That was the thing he would remember, that she was not made of stone, that something crossed her face that in another life, begun another way, might have been the beginning of everything. But she had done her sum, and it was finished, and she was not a woman who unmade a finished sum to spare a man the consequences of his own arithmetic. She said quite gently that she believed him. That was the hardest part, and she gave it to him honestly. She believed that he meant it, and she thought even that it might be true. But, she said, he had taught her something that spring that he could not now unteach her, however sorry he was. He had taught her, patiently, night after night, exactly what it is to live as a thing that is valued at a price, and she had learned it all the way down. And she was not going to spend the rest of her life as the price he was now willing to pay, instead of the price he had once refused. A woman bought cheap and a woman bought dear, she said, are both of them women who have been bought, and she had watched her father die rather than let his name be mortgaged. And she was her father's daughter, and her name was the one thing she owned outright, and she was going to keep it that way. She was sorry. She thought he might in time become a good man, better certainly than the one she had married. But she was not going to stay to watch it, and pay for it, and be thanked for it. She had somewhere to be. And she pushed the guinea very gently back across the table to him, and closed her father's book, and stood up. She left on a bright morning a fortnight later in the grey gown, with one trunk and her father's book, and not one thing of his, but the name she could not give back, and she used even that ever after. Plainly and without shame, Frances, Duchess of Alderholt, of the Yorkshire Wolds, a grave and much respected woman who ran a good school and a good house, and was known through 3 ridings for a stillness that steadied people, and who never once in 40 years told the story of the guinea to a living soul, because it was his to be ashamed of and not hers to tell. Josiah Kerr saw her settled and lived to be very old, and left her, when he went, a sum that made her wholly independent, and it was the last time anyone tried to value Meade's daughter, and the only time the figure was right, because it came with no strings and expected no return, which is the only price that was ever her own. The Duke of Alderholt did not remarry. He did not lose his mind, or his fortune, or his consequence. The world went on calling him His Grace, and he went on being witty, more quietly now, at other men's tables. But he became, over a great many years, and with nobody to see it and no credit to be had for it, something he had never in his life set out to be, which was a decent man, careful of his sister, who married well and forgave him slowly, honest in his accounts, kind in the plain, unshowy way he had learned too late to under footmen with dying mothers. Georgiana said when she was old that her brother had 2 lives, and that the seam between them was a single spring, and a woman in a grey gown, and a coin he could never afterward be persuaded to spend. For he kept the guinea. He kept it to the end of his life, worn smooth at last with 40 years of a proud man's thumb, and he never once let it out of his keeping. And when he was dying, an old man in a great empty house, and his sister asked him, because she had always half wondered, why he had never had it made into a ring, or a seal, or given it to a beggar, or thrown it in the Thames, he told her the truth, which was the last true thing he said, and the only inheritance of any worth he had to leave, because it is the most expensive thing in England, said the Duke of Alderholt. And I am the only man alive who knows the price of it. She told me once I should feel the force of that. I have felt it every day for 40 years. It is a guinea. It cost me the whole of my life, and it was cheap at that, and I would not part with it for the world, because it is the only honest reckoning I was ever handed, and I have been trying ever since to be worth the change. If this story of a proud man and the wife he priced too low held you to the last of the candle, do a kind thing for the tellers of it. Press the like button and share it with a fellow lover of grounded historical romance and slow, deeply drawn drama. Subscribe to The Duke's Undoing so that you never miss the next chapter of a powerful man learning, too late, or almost too late, exactly what he threw away. And tell us below, for we read every answer, She believed that he had truly changed, and she left him all the same. Was she right to keep the one thing that was wholly her own? Or should a genuine, ruinous, too late repentance be enough to earn a second chance?